Hey everyone, welcome to the Coding Zoo. If this is your first time joining, my name is Shane, and this is our HTML building blocks series. We are on lesson number 12. In this lesson, we are going to cover the HTML5 semantic elements that replace the use of using div. Those elements include header, nav, footer, and main. And if we have time, we're going to jump into sections, article, and aside, and a few others. If we can't get to those today, we will cover those in the next lesson. We will kind of also cover why you should use these elements versus div and when you should use div. Kind of go over that too. If that interests you, hey, stick around. We're going to jump right in. Hey guys, let's go ahead and jump in. So on my desktop here, you can see my attempt of drawing a web page and dividing it up into sections. Hopefully it makes sense. And this is by no means the way it has to be. There's different ways of doing this and dividing up your content. It's really about your intent and what you're trying to do. In our previous lessons, we covered div and span. We covered the difference in the two, and we also mentioned these HTML5 elements, but we didn't go in depth into those elements, and that's what we hope to do today. I'm going to go over these elements real quickly and what's the difference in them and what's the difference in using them plus div and sub, and then we're going to jump into the code. So if you want to just go ahead and jump into the code, I'll put a little shortcut down in the comments to get you there. But I think it's important that you understand when to use div, when to use span, and when to use these elements. What's the difference, right? So let's first kind of go over that, and then we'll jump to this drawing and kind of talk about it. So a div and a span, right? A span is inline element. It's not a block element like a div. A div kind of separates everything from around it. A span is more inline to the given content. A div is not. I won't go into detail there. We've got a previous video if you want to learn more about that. Throughout the years, as we've been using div, we've kind of added these IDs to the div that give it meaning around the content you're wrapping. So for example, I think it was Google who did the investigation or who dug into it, but I think these HTML5 elements were created from that investigation. And what they did is they looked at all the documents out there and what were the most used IDs that were being put on divs to give the content meaning. And what they found is heading, or header rather, was used quite a bit. Footer was used a lot. So at most of your web pages, people were putting a div ID equals header and div ID equals footer and so forth. I think main was another one. So there's section, and then there's aside, and there's navigation. So those are some of the most used IDs that were used on divs. So they went ahead in the HTML5 spec and created elements to go ahead and represent those different entities, right? So the basic idea is these entities have semantic meaning. By looking at the element heading or header, you know what the content is. It's the header of the document. It has meaning, right? Div just means divide. It can be divided up for different reasons. It could be divided up because it has meaning, or it could be divided up because you just want to style something differently than the rest of the document. So div doesn't really have this semantic meaning. In the past, we gave it meaning by putting an ID on it, and that ID had meaning, but you don't have to do that anymore for certain topics, for certain content, because they created these new elements. So the general rule should be, if you can use these new elements, they fit the meaning of what you're doing, use these new elements. You don't use them, for example, don't use section to break up your document into sections for styling. Section has more semantic meaning. If you have a group of sections, group of data that makes up one topic, right? So if you have a document, it has sections. That document has a topic. Those sections are different subtopics of that main topic. So section is used for semantic meaning, not for styling purposes. So if you want to break up data for styling purposes, use div. If you want to put meaning around the different sets of data, put sections. Think of a section as like a chapter in a book. You have a book that's a whole story, and you got sections. Well, those sections are chapters. That's a good way to think of it. There are going to be times that you don't have an element that makes sense, and you use div and you use ID, and the ID has some meaning to it. You do that, right? So the general rule should be use these HTML5 elements for semantic meaning, not just to style some random content. Use div and span for grouping data for styling. Don't use them for providing contextual meaning unless you have to. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, hey, leave a question below. We'll go over it in more detail through questions below. Hopefully this makes sense. Let's go ahead and jump into the diagram. So the elements we're going to cover in this lesson are going to be header, main and footer, and nav for sure. If we have time, we're going to jump into what I find more interesting and a little bit more complicated to decide when to use which is section and article and aside. So if we don't get to section, article, and aside in this lesson, we'll cover it in the next lesson. So cool. So a header can be, a header of your document. It can be a header of an article also. Your article can have a header and footer, right? The header has introductory content about what you're fixing to talk about, right? It can also contain like a logo that represents that content. It can contain like navigational type information, contain a title, etc. So pretty self-explanatory. Header's good. I think we all get that one. Footer, same thing. It can be footer of your document. It can also be footer of a different article. A footer contains information about the article or document. Usually it's information like who wrote it, how they can be contacted. You can have an address element inside of there. You can have copyright information. You can have other things such as, like some footers sometimes have sections. Those sections could be indexes, could be license agreements, etc. You put that kind of information in a footer. Used to, we'd have a divide and we have ID equals footer. Well, you don't have to do that anymore. We've got an element called footer. All right, main. Main is basically should wrap your main content of your page. This is the main topic of your page. Okay, and then we have nav, which is basically navigation. This is where I'm going to have the links to navigate within this document or within this web page or within this website. So again, pretty self-explanatory, not very hard to understand. Okay, so my main element here contains section elements. Well, these sections are a group of sections. They are similar to each other. They relate to each other. They are like subtopics of a main topic. They're subcontext of a main context. That's why you have these groupings together. So for example, each section should or could have a title and then content. And that title is like a subtopic. It's like a chapter, right? It's like a chapter title of your book, right? So these are grouped together and they relate to each other. Now, and each one of them should have like a title to show that you're going to like a subtopic of the main topic. Now, the next item we have here is an article. An article is similar to a section, but it's actually something that stands alone. It's really not necessarily part of the overall topic being mentioned on this page. It's an article that can be ripped out of this page and put into another page and make complete sense by itself. Whereas the sections maybe not so much, because they may relate to each other and talk about each other and point to each other, etc. They're a part of a book. They're a chapter of a book. Would a chapter make sense of a book by itself? Sometimes maybe, but most of the time you want to read the other chapters, right? Okay, so an article can have sections. An article can also have a header and a footer. It can also have sections built in. I tend to want to use main and wrap all my sections in an article and then have several articles in the web page. It's really up to you on how you want to do that. Let's go ahead and jump into the code. So I have my index.html file. I have my styles.css. It's from a template we created in the first lesson in this series. I recommend that you stop the video and code as I code. It will help you to remember what you're learning today. If you don't have time for that, we do have the code for download on our website, decodingzoo.com. Check it out. Say, hey, what's this page about, right? So we want to give some introductory information. So I want to go ahead and add a header first, right? So in my headers, I like to add a logo and a title, and I also like to put navigation in my headers. And keep in mind, a header can be the header to a page, it can be a header to an article. So sometimes, navigation in an article doesn't make sense. Sometimes it does. Maybe you want to jump from sections to sections in an article, so who knows. But okay, I'm going to go ahead, and I like to wrap my logo and my title in a div so I can style it differently than the rest of my header. So header gives it semantic meaning. This is my introductory information. It's my header, and the div will be used for the styling, right, of the banner part of my header. Okay, so I'm going to create a div. I'm going to give it ID equals banner, and let's go ahead and put a logo. So I'm going to cheat a little bit to save time. Again, if we go too fast, feel free to stop the video and catch up. So I'm going to cut and paste an image. Whoa, that's long. Let's break that down a little bit. There we go. So I've got an image, points to our logo, and I want to add my title. So I want to tell what the article is about. So H1 for title, the coding zoo. I want to tell what this website's about, rather. All right, let's go down to outside of that div, and I want to put some navigation. So I'm going to add a Nav Tab for navigation. Inside the Nav Tab, I'm going to put each entry of my navigation inside of a list. Let's do UL, and I'm going to add a line item. And the first one, well, it'll be the main, which is the kind of the page we're on, and let's make it a short navigation, and I'm going to call it, let's have an about page. Okay, so I have my header. It has a logo, it has a title, and it also has navigation. All right, now next I want to put a main element in the page that contains the main content of my page. So I'm going to add main, and I'm also going to add a footer. This footer can have information such as copyright information, can have the artist's information, even like an address element for contact information, all that good stuff. Keep in mind, a footer can be a footer of your document, your main document. It can also be a footer of an article that's inside of the main document, right? All right, so I add the footer. Let's go ahead and put copyright by the two. Okay, so I've added a footer. I'm going to save it. So I have the main three elements of my page. I have a header. The header has a navigation, and it also has a main for my main content, and I have my footer. So header, main, footer. Now, again, used to, we'd have a div that says div and then ID equals header. People would do that. Then they have another div for the nav, and be div ID equals nav, right? Then we'd have another div for main, and ID equals main, right? So these elements replace that. All right, let's go over and add some CSS so we can get a clear picture of what this looks like instead of being all scrunched up. Let's add a little style to it. I think if let's do a refresh. So kind of big there, right? So hard to see. Let's go ahead and add some CSS. I'm going to put some basic styling on my body. So margin 0 pixels, padding 0 pixels. Let's go up and fix my G there. I can't type today. Margin. All right, let's add some styling to my header. So header. And I'm going to put a border around it. I like to, until my page is done, I like to put borders around each piece of my document. It makes it a lot easier to see what you're doing, in my opinion. You can also see each piece by inspecting your document and hovering over it. I like to put a border, just kind of old school that way. I'm going to put an overflow tag just so the header will flow correctly once we add all the other attributes to the other tags. So I'm going to make the header 100%. I'm going to add a padding of 0. And background color, let's do black. And let's do color, white. Okay. Now in my header I have a banner. Let's go ahead and put some styling around it. Let's cut and paste. Save some time. I'm all about saving time. Okay, let's do 49%. I don't want to take up my whole header. And I want it to kind of float to the left. We're going to use float for now. In upcoming videos in a CSS building block series, we're going to cover how to use a CSS grid instead of using float. To move stuff around. So look for that video in the next couple of weeks. It should be coming out soon. We'll get into grid and how you can do this with grid. I forget my semicolon there. Now I'm going to put a header image so large, right? So I'm going to put styling around it, 0 pixels. For the margin, I want the float to the left also, and I want a width. Let's make it pretty small. Let's do 12%, and let's put a border around it also. Why not? I think I still have it. There we go. Yeah. And let's go ahead and do the same for nav. Let's put some styling around it. Nav. And typically, I'd turn those that list into where it's not a list, but it's more of a hover over squares and buttons and stuff. But we're not going to do that today. Maybe the next in the next video. Okay, so I'm going to do a float right. I want to go to the right side of my header. Do color white. Let's do margin right, say like 10 pixels. And let's do border 2 pixels. This part's kind of boring to you, I'm sure. I just want to show you how those things are laid out on the page, right? Okay. Let's try that. Choose File. And let's refresh it. There we go. All right, so I have my logo here. Here's my banner. Here's my title. It's inside this header. This whole box here is the header. Here's my nav. Here's my footer. Well, I don't have any content in my body, so my footer is right up against my header. Hey, let's change that a little bit. Let's add some content, and let's put a little styling around my footer. I would usually put sections and articles. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to cover that in the next lesson, so I'm just going to slap in some content real quick just to give it some better look and feel so you get an idea. All right, so my main, I'm just going to slap in some lorem ipsum. I guess that's how you say that, lorem ipsum. So slap that in there so get a little look and feel going. Footer, let's go put some styling on my footer. Okay, footer. Background color. Let's do black. Color white. Add a little padding. And let's go ahead and add the border. Okay. All right, file, save. I'm going to add just a little bit more content again so it looks cleaner for what I'm trying to show you. There we go. File, save. All right. Okay, so this is my page. You'll notice I don't have any padding on that main. Let's add it real quick. Clean it up a little bit. So main padding, let's do 10 pixels. Refresh. There we go. Kind of cleaned it up a little bit. So that's it. So I replaced the divs I would usually use with these HTML5 elements. They have meaning, right? Here's my header. Here's a nav element that's inside of my header. Here's a main element which contains all of my content for the main purpose of this page. And here's my footer, which contains information about who wrote the page, copyright, all that good stuff. All right, hey, let's remove those ugly borders to see what it looks like. Let's get rid of them. I'll probably put them back for the next lesson because we're going to be moving stuff around a little bit. File, save. Now, again, you don't have to use the borders. I like to use them. You can also look at the different pieces of your document by inspecting, right? Just kind of hovering over things like this, right? I can tell what is what by just hovering, right? So that's one way to do it. I tend to like to just go ahead and put the border around it at times. Let me click refresh. There we go. Looks much better. got my header, got my main content, got my footer. Pretty simple, not much to it. Just wanted to show you how you would use this instead of divs. In the next lesson, we're going to cover article and section and aside. That's a little bit more interesting. I always get confused. When do I use article? When do I use section? All that good stuff, right? When do I use aside? It's kind of confusing to me at first, but I think I have a good handle on it. Let's go over it and we'll talk about it in the next lesson. I hope to see you there. If you have any comments about this lesson, leave them below. We'll get back to you as soon as possible. I hope you enjoy the lesson. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining.